I watched the Matt Walsh documentary, What is a Woman? And my verdict is this. It's a failure. It completely misses the mark. Walsh completely fails to counter the transgender movement. For those of you who haven't watched the documentary, basically his whole goal is to make proponents of transgender ideology look as ridiculous as possible. He goes to academics, professional psychologists, physicians, and just average left-wing Americans and asks them, what is a woman? And no one can answer him in a coherent and non-circular way. The whole documentary is Walsh getting people stuck in these embarrassing gotcha moments where they clearly contradict themselves or remain silent because they know if they were to answer his questions, they would contradict themselves. He basically portrays these people as completely delusional. So why is this a failure? The problem is Walsh is attacking the weakest transgender position. His documentary focuses on the easiest transgender position to knock down, but he completely ignores stronger, more coherent arguments in favor of transgender ideology. He ignores these arguments because, and this might surprise you, but Walsh really has no problem with transgenderism. This is why people like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro are frauds, as are mainstream conservatives in general. So Walsh's entire approach fails. Let me prove it to you. Imagine if someone were to tell Walsh, look, people are born with a certain set of genitalia. They're born with a certain set of reproductive organs. But why should their genitalia define who they are for the rest of their lives? Just because you're born with a penis or a vagina, why should that define you or obligate you to live as a man or a woman? Why can't people have the freedom to choose how to define themselves however they want? Shouldn't all individuals have the freedom to choose how they want to live their lives? And shouldn't people not be stigmatized for these choices? Now, how would Matt Walsh respond to this argument? Let's just imagine possible responses. For example, Matt Walsh might respond, well, I don't want to be forced to use certain pronouns. Okay, no problem. Don't use the pronouns. Would Matt Walsh be okay with transgender then? Or Walsh might respond and say, well, we shouldn't be doing these medical procedures on children. Okay, no problem. We'll only allow people over 18 to get transgender medical procedures. Would Matt Walsh be okay with transgender then? Or Walsh might respond, well, these gender transitions lead to people who have a lot of regret and they can't reverse it. Okay, no problem. Medical science will continue to develop these procedures in order to significantly improve the quality of life of transgender people. And furthermore, eventually, due to medical advancements, these procedures will become 100% reversible. Would Matt Walsh be okay with transgender then? Or Walsh might respond, well, a woman has to have a female reproductive system in order to truly be a woman. So if I have to call a transgender woman a woman, I would be lying, and I care so much about the truth. Okay, no problem. Medical science will continue to advance, and one day it could be possible to give a person a completely functional womb, or use genetic engineering to actually change a person's chromosomes to match their chosen gender. Would Walsh be okay with transgender then? So imagine in the future, technology has all these advancements and a person can completely change their genetics and develop functional reproductive organs of the opposite sex, and the entire thing is reversible, and these people enjoy the highest levels of personal satisfaction and quality of life. What would Matt Walsh's objection to all this be? None of the criticisms he has against transgender ideology would matter in this case. And if he asked a transgender person to define what a woman is, that person can easily define a woman. A woman has female biology, and thankfully, technology now has the ability to allow biological men to fully become biological women with all the working organs and genetics. What do you have to say to that, Matt Walsh? This is the way that proponents of transgender ideology can actually own Matt Walsh in these debates. In this scenario with future technology, Matt Walsh or Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson, they would be forced to say, well, looks like there's really no problem here. In fact, they would be forced to support transgender because these guys are proponents of classical liberalism. And classical liberalism is all about maximizing individual freedom and individual happiness. So if the technology exists where people can actually increase their freedom by changing their gender, and that choice comes with no harm, no regret, and it actually increases a person's happiness, then the classical liberal position would be to 100% support that. Basically, the problem that Matt Walsh and others on the right wing have with transgender are just problems with the technology. Right now, the technology is not advanced enough to avoid the downsides that Walsh focuses on in his documentary. But if that technology improves, then what really would be Walsh's objection to transgender? As far as we can tell, he wouldn't really have any. The problem with Matt Walsh and these other Ben Shapiro types is they don't understand that gender ideology didn't begin with Alfred Kinsey in the 1940s or 50s. Gender ideology began with the Enlightenment over 200 years ago. It began with classical liberalism. This idea that people should not be obligated to live in a certain way just because biology says so. Originally, this was the idea that people should not be obligated to live in a certain way just because God says so. That was the original rebellion, the rebellion of classical liberals against the design of God as defined by scripture and traditional religion. The entire conceit of the Enlightenment was that it overthrew the authority of God in the lives of man. Obeying God and living according to His commands were no longer the central concerns of morality, politics, social structure, or lifestyle. No, the central concern of all of these things, according to classical liberalism, is maximizing freedom, equality, and choice. Classical liberals announced to the world, we are not bound by these old ideas about God. Modern transgenders are continuing that legacy to the T, saying we are not bound by these old ideas about gender. It is the exact same impulse. Historically, this classical liberal obsession with choice eventually attacked every traditional institution. Gender was actually one of the early targets. The earliest feminists ask, just because we're born as women, that doesn't mean we should be limited to specific roles within society. We should be able to vote. We should be able to hold political office. We should be completely equal to men in these ways. That was the so-called first wave of feminism. In the second wave, the feminists took it one step further. They said, just because we are born as women, we should not be obligated to serve specific roles in our family either. Why should women be homemakers and men breadwinners? Why can't everyone choose for themselves? Then, in the third wave, they took it even one step further. The feminists said, well, just because we're born with a particular set of genitalia, we should not be obligated to live as that particular sex either. That's the basic step-by-step logic that connects the modern transgender movement to classical liberalism. It's all one long, 200-year slippery slope. So Matt Walsh and these other conservative figures, they have long ago conceded the most fundamental premise underlying the transgender movement. They long ago conceded to first wave, second wave, third wave feminism. They long ago conceded to this idea that if God and tradition say one thing, it's okay to ignore God and tradition in order to pursue your individual choice, and the secular state actually must guarantee that individual right to essentially rebel against God. They conceded on the issue of the sexual revolution. They conceded on the issue of gay marriage. They conceded on the issue of the empowered career woman and everything that entails. They conceded on the issue of access to contraception. They conceded on the issue of no-fault divorce. They conceded on the issue of taking God out of schools, taking God out of family, taking God out of society as a whole. That's the legacy of Matt Walsh and Fox News conservatism. Just one concession after another. So Matt Walsh really can't give a principled opposition to transgender. He lies to his audience because he makes it seem like if we could just stop giving puberty blockers to children, that will be enough to preserve good old-fashioned family values. But this is a repugnant lie. Classical liberalism has completely destroyed the traditional family and good old-fashioned family values. For example, how can you have a traditional family without gender roles? How can you have a traditional family without this idea of the father as the patriarch who provides and protects his family and has authority, and a mother who nourishes her family and makes the home? These distinctions between the genders were destroyed long before the modern transgender movement and long before Alfred Kinsey, the guy that Walsh blames for all these problems. The first group to blur the line between the genders was actually the classical liberal thinkers, who believed that men and women are fundamentally similar. If Matt Walsh really has a problem with gender re-engineering and blurring the lines between genders, he should start with 19th century classical liberals like John Stuart Mill, who started this idea that women should delay getting married and should instead pursue an education. He should blame the classical liberals who pushed for women to join the workforce. He should blame the first wave feminists who said women should be involved in politics. He should blame 20th century liberals for promoting this idea of sexual freedom. All of these things have contributed to re-engineering female psychology and male psychology. Transgenderism is really only the latest step in a long history of destroying the distinction between men and women, a long history of gender re-engineering driven by this classical liberal value of individual freedom and equality. I would even go so far as to argue that people like Matt Walsh actually help advance the transgender movement. This is because he is conditioning his audience to think about the issue primarily in terms of biology and science. But biology and science are continually advancing, and it's conceivable that future developments will allow for complete biological gender transition. Matt Walsh-type conservatives won't be able to object at that point. In fact, Matt Walsh and his followers will be forced to say, yes, transgender women are women because the biology is all there. Matt Walsh will have to be the biggest supporter of transgender in that situation. And actually, we don't have to wait very long to see these conservatives join onto the transgender movement. You can already find drag queen performers at Republican conventions and transgender pundits on conservative news channels like Fox News. Now, let me say some words as a Muslim. As a Muslim, it's really easy for me to see the difference between Matt Walsh's stance on transgender and the Islamic stance. The essence of Matt Walsh's problem with transgenderism is the technology is just not sophisticated enough to actually change people's biology to transform them into another sex. But if the tech were sophisticated enough and people ended up being happier, he really wouldn't have any principled objection. His classical liberalism actually forces him to be fully on board with transgender ideology. But for Muslims, it doesn't matter how good the tech is or how much happiness people derive from being able to choose their gender. We have priorities beyond individual happiness and individual freedom. We're happy to limit people's choices and say, look, sometimes not everything is about maximizing choice. Not everything is about maximizing freedom. Sometimes you can't have equality of the sexes because the sexes are fundamentally different. You have to accept what God has chosen for you and all the obligations that come with that. You have to follow God's plan, whether you want to or not. Imagine in the future, a 25-year-old man decides to get this high-tech gender transition that will give him the complete biology of a woman. Muslims would object to this. Muslims would say, no, this is a violation of God's design. As Muslims, we cannot accept this. But Matt Walsh and other conservative Christians at that time would pop up and say, no. We've checked the biology, and this trans woman is definitely a real woman. And shame on you, backwards Muslims, for being so intolerant and hateful. And why can't you be compassionate like Jesus Christ, who was 100% pro-trans, pro-LGBTQ+? That is going to be what conservatives like Matt Walsh and Ben Shapiro are going to be saying against Islam in maybe 5 or 10 years. But that's fine. Muslims are happy with the Islamic stance because we have a principled objection to this entire gender ideology and feminism and so forth. The same objection that has allowed Muslims to resist liberalism, to resist feminist reforms, to resist secularism, to resist the sexual revolution, and all the other modern ideologies that are destroying mankind.